So I grew up in a time when you believed what you were told. You believed what the government said. You had no reason to question it because, to your knowledge, you had never been lied to before. But with everything that we've learned over the past 3 years, I think it's reasonable when people say that they're skeptical about what public health is telling us and what the government is telling us. What they're telling us may very well be true, and it very well may not be, or the truth might be somewhere in between. And this is the dilemma. We just don't know. But I've always relied on people that I consider to be much smarter than me to help me make the decisions as to what to do regarding my health. Should I take high blood pressure medicine? Should I manage my cholesterol? Should I reduce fat in my diet? Should I reduce sugar in my diet? All of these things have been proposed, and some of them have been proven to be beneficial, and some haven't. Just last week, my hospital reinstituted a universal mask policy for everyone because there's some rising COVID cases in the area. Interestingly, the neighboring hospitals in my city have decided to do a wait and see approach. And I think that right there illustrates the confusion over policy and what works and what doesn't work. Because the fact of the matter is, we really don't know what works or what doesn't work. There are camps of people that wholeheartedly believe that, for example, masks are effective at reducing the spread of COVID-19. And that may be true, but there's another camp that believes that that's not the case. And there's been some research that supports the fact that masks may not be as effective as we were told. My issue, my own personal issue, and this is where, somebody can call me a conspiracy theorist. I can't stand that phrase, but that's a phrase that has arisen over the past 3 years along with gaslighting. If you wear a plastic mask over your face for hours at a time, and that mask is made of fibers, plastic fibers, isn't it reasonable to assume that over the course of an hour or two or more of wearing that mask and it rubbing against your face, that you might loosen some plastic particulates that you might then inhale? And we're talking about plastic particulates that are nanoparticle in size. So wouldn't it be reasonable to wonder, to hypothesize that you could be inhaling nanoplastics as a result of wearing a mask? And I think about it this way. I've worn surgical masks over the last 35, 40 years of my work in healthcare. But I've always worn them procedurally, for a procedure, for a brief period of time, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it may be. I haven't worn them for hours at a time or an entire 8 or 10 or 12-hour shift. Certainly early in the pandemic, we were wearing those for the entire shift because there was this concern that there was a shortage. Apparently there's no shortage now because masks, as all of us know, masks were everywhere. They were in every grocery store and coffee shop and strewn across every parking lot. And the thing that I find interesting is when you try to look up the literature regarding, let's say, the inhalation of plastic nanoparticles, you don't find very much. You do find research that indicates that those discarded masks and the associated plastic nanoparticles are harmful to fish and waterfowl and the aquatic system in general. There's no mention of whether that mask was potentially harmful to the wearer prior to discarding it in the parking lot or wherever. So there's clearly a gap in the published research about this, but I think, again, as a thinking person, it's reasonable to ask the question, is a mask harmful to me? Maybe not today, right now, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Is this the asbestosis of our future? Is this the mesothelioma of our future? These are reasonable questions, but these are questions that I can't ask, not at the academic institution I work at, because I would be asked to leave probably before the end of the shift. They would probably keep me there till the end of the shift to get a full workday out of me, and then they would ask me to leave. But I think these are reasonable questions to ask. I've made videos regarding this topic before, and I've shown a Chinese paper that was published at the very beginning of the pandemic that showed electron micrograph pictures of various masks and how much loose particulate is on a mask even before it's worn. So I think it's reasonable to assume that there's probably some potential level of harm. But that's not even mentioned. What's mentioned is that we need to wear a mask to prevent the spread of COVID. And this is something that I don't think very many of us buy to the same degree that we did back in 2020. But I just happened to come across a paper. This is an essay that was written in 2016 in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, May 17th, 2016. And I just want to read little bits and pieces of it. I won't read the entire thing, but I'll read bits and pieces because it really speaks to where we were in 2016. And it begs the question, what happened between 2016 and 2020? I don't think anything had really changed. But this was the perception. And this was written by a physician who was working on his PhD at the time. And it goes like this. When I walk past my waiting room, I see people wearing surgical masks. This scene becomes surreal when my patients are watching pandemic disaster movies on the wall-mounted television screen, movies that feature frightened crowds who wear similar masks in the vain hope of protection. As my eyes move from mask-wearing patients to screaming on-screen characters and back, I wonder, what's happening here? As represented by our cinema and other media, Western society expects too much of masks. In the public's mind, the still legitimate use of masks for source control has gone off-label. Masks are thought to prevent infection. From here, another problem arises. Because surgical masks are thought to protect against infection in the community setting, people wearing masks for legitimate purposes, such as those who have a cough in the hospital, let's say, form part of the larger misperception and act to reinforce it. Even this proper use of surgical masks is incorporated into a larger improper use in the era of pandemic fear, especially in Asia where such fear is very high. The widespread misconception about the use of surgical masks, that wearing a mask protects against the transmission of virus, is a problem of the kind theorized by German sociologist Ulrich Beck. Now, I'll leave a link to Beck's essay in the comment below. I think it's worth reading. So he goes on to talk about the evolution and history of the surgical mask, and that the technology was applied outside of the operating room in an effort to control the spread of infectious epidemics. In the 1919 influenza pandemic, masks were available and were dispensed to populations, but they had no impact on the epidemic curve. At the time, it was unknown that the influenza organism, which is what was being talked about for the most part in this paper, is a nanoscopic particle and can theoretically penetrate the surgical mask barrier. As recently as 2010, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences declared that in the community setting, face masks are not designed or certified to protect the wearer from exposure to respiratory hazards. A number of studies have shown the inefficacy of the surgical mask in household settings to prevent transmission of the influenza virus. So I'll stop reading it there, but my concern is this. Not only the potential for inhalation of microplastics, which, again, I think that's reasonable to at least consider that. It could be true, it may not be true, I don't know. But it's something that needs to be studied, along with studying the effectiveness of masks in and of themselves. But the bigger and the more pertinent question to me is, what effect does it have on the doctor-patient relationship or on the nurse-patient relationship? I can't see my patient's face when he's wearing a mask. He can't see mine. And that definitely affects communication. It affects communication for people who can hear and speak clearly. A lot of the patients that I see in the emergency department require an interpreter. They're non-English speaking, and it just reduces communication more. But it really affects your ability to sense the nonverbals. And I think that anyone who has worked at the bedside in a clinical capacity knows the importance of trying to understand your patient's condition through nonverbal as well as verbal communication. I think that if masks were undoubtedly proven to be effective, there wouldn't be a question here. But because if you do a Google search, you'll find that this newspaper says masks work completely. This newspaper reports a study that says masks don't work at all. And it's still this back and forth thing. As recently as just a few months ago, do a Google search on the effectiveness of masks and it'll drive you crazy. But when we institute a policy like we did, back over the last 3 years without strong evidence to support its effectiveness, and when you have other neighboring hospitals not following it, then it really makes you wonder, okay, what's really going on? Talk to us like we're educated adults and tell us why we're doing this or why we're not doing it. And don't just say we're doing it because we have more sick outs, more call outs amongst hospital staff, which apparently is true from what I'm told, but also that there's an increased number in the community. Interestingly, there's a smaller hospital not too far from here that had a mask policy in effect until just about a month ago, and they just lifted their mask policy. Now, wouldn't you think if they just lifted the mask policy, and if masks were that effective, then they should have probably about a zero COVID risk in that hospital. But of course, they'll blame that on the fact that as soon as people leave the hospital, they take their mask off, they go to the grocery store and get infected. So the bottom line is this. I don't think it makes a huge difference. I think for people who want to wear a mask, you should be allowed to wear a mask. I mean, God bless you. Want to wear a mask? Wear one. If you don't want to wear one, then I think you should be given that option. But I don't get a vote in the matter. But it does bother me, which is why I made this video. I'd like to know what your thoughts are. I mean, am I wrong? It really makes me wonder, am I really off base here? I don't see anything in the literature that tells me to think one way versus the other. There just isn't good convincing data. If anything, it may tip more in favor of mask ineffectiveness than mask effectiveness. And this is where it becomes a cultural, a political issue, and a virtue signaling issue, and all these other things that I just can't stand. So please comment. Tell me if I'm right or wrong. I'd love to hear. And I'll talk to you on the next video. Thanks. Bye.